we have here a section called, the section about a hero called Sekandar. Who is Sekandar? Yes?
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great. Sekandar sort of sounds like Alexander, and they have another reason in here for why the name change. But briefly, Alexander the Great, Alex to his friends, Big Al to his really good friends, a Macedonian prince from, what is it, the 3rd or 4th century BCE, got a bug for travel and conquest. And so, taking leave of his father, Philip, the king of Macedonia, and Macedonia was a significant power player at the time. It's a relatively small country, but it had just basically taken over Greece. So when in this section they talk about the Greeks, it's like, oh, well, are they really Greeks? Well, they're kind of Greeks. Alexander created one of the great empires of the ancient world. Marching out of the Greek peninsula, he went across North Africa and spread east into India, modern Pakistan. It's not, again, we're talking, ish kind of dates and areas. And he is the reason why there is a conspicuous number of cities in those areas named Alexandria or something along that way. Alexandria, Egypt is one of the great cities of North Africa. But you can find Alexandria, Alexandrun. There are a number of other different iterations of it all throughout. That's a trail of conquest. He died while on the road with his troops, and that was fairly young. I don't remember exactly how young, but I have it here. What is that? Like 30, 35 years old, something like that. Young man, and an extraordinary life of accomplishment. He is one figure within this larger book, of course, and maybe the only reason that he is singled out here is because he is the most familiar to the Western audiences that the good people at Norton are addressing largely here. There's some other great stories in there. They have a great hero named Rostrum, whose his story is quite the rollicking adventure with lots of significance for the broader culture. But here we get this story of Sekandar or Alexander. And it's coming at the end of this one long section about heroes, the heroic age. So I said that the heroes section then gives way to the historical section. Well, history is essentially coming in here. This is a kind of reality. Alexander is a historical person. We have plenty of records about him, whereas some of the heroes that came before him in this book and their stories are probably more legendary figures. But you can look at that a couple of different ways as him coming in and changing the character of the times. He is, in a way, a kind of capstone to the heroic age, the exclamation point at the end of it, or he is a corruption. They finally let in that freaky Westerner, and everything went to hell after that. he is very necessary in this to maintain a self-image that Persia maintained about itself, which is that it had never been conquered by an outside force. This is an article of faith. Nope, never. Well, you can say this and say that, well, sure, we've had changes of government. They've all been internal, never an invader. But Alexander, for his own predilection of naming things after himself and all, was a very obvious and glaring contradiction to that claim. He was certainly an outsider, and he came in and he was a conquering force. The poet needed to deal with this. Ferdowsi looked at this and said, all right, what if he wasn't an outsider? What if he was a secret Persian all along? And we get that in this first section where we see a king of Persia married to I think it's a daughter of Philip, which would be Alexander's or Sekandar's sister then. And the family thing gets dicey. But they get married, and the wife has bad breath, which I kind of like. You know, it's the little things about marriage that make it a significant institution. The wife has bad breath. The king is just sort of turned off by it. Like, ugh, lady, you stink. What are you going to do? He comes up with a special herb that they can rub on the inside of her mouth, essentially brushing her teeth or using mouthwash or however you want to do it, or chewing gum, I guess, would actually be the closest thing. Apparently it burns a little, but, you know, the king doesn't really care. It's getting rid of the stink, deal with the pain. And that herb is called Sekandar. So you can see a couple of things on that. One, it is a not too veiled diss at the East, or rather the West. You know, the Westerners come in, they're dirty, they smell. Okay, fine. Guilty as charged, personally. But also, it is a wild piece of nature inherent in Persia. A piece of local flora that is able to make her tolerable. The natural products of Persia have a sweetening effect. Little things like that. You know, it's really easy to just say, it's funny, she smells. But you start to weave those facts into the larger tapestry and say, oh, okay. It's not just about laughing at the stinky girl. It's about understanding what the purpose of that was. The purpose is to take a little shot at the European, but also create this drama where it is something naturally flowering in the Persian soil itself that makes everything a little sweeter. Of course, though, being a guy, once Stinky Girl got her mouthwash, and they have their little wedding night, being a guy, the king loses interest the next morning. Who are you again? Guys, you know, ladies, I'm sorry. She goes back to Macedonia, finds out soon enough that she is with child, the child of the king of Persia, Darab, and is born as the Prince of Macedonia, named after the root that allowed his conception to happen, Sekandar. So you get a somewhat amusing backdoor explanation as to why Alexander was secretly a Persian all along. And it comes out also that he is not only a Persian, but he is the firstborn son of this king, who goes on to have another son named after him, known to the West as Darius. I think here it's Daru. But again, you know, this isn't just soap opera. This is deliberate, and they're creating a rationale for something, because Darius II becomes the new king upon the death of his father, but he is, as we have seen, the secret second-born. Second-born sons, and I'm one of them, are worth nothing. Historically, they're completely irrelevant. If anything, they're a burden. Firstborn sons, as every firstborn son knows, well, they're the light of their grandparents' eye. They can do no wrong. Everything is good. I'm seeing some smiles that tell me that there are some firstborn sons in this room. Life is good to be a firstborn son, especially in this era when that meant that you were first in line for all of the money, all of the property, all of the titles. And if you're the son of a king, that means you're the next king. But this little family drama means that there is an irregularity there. Something unnatural happened. Remember the focus on natural with the herb? Here, something unnatural happened in that Sekandar was whisked away out of his proper home of Persia. So now he has to come back. Now, when he does come back, and we have the historical record of him coming back, he comes back as a conquering force at the head of a large army. But of course, if he is just restoring what was rightfully his to begin with, if he's just claiming his birthright conferred on him by the almost universal law of primogeniture, that's natural. That's what God wants. So the poem is creating this rationale for him coming in and taking over. And we get this curious scene where he comes in and defeats Darius II, but Darius gets quite the deathbed scene. Always pay attention to that. When you see somebody in a movie, let's say, I always go to movies because it's universal storytelling. When you see somebody getting that deathbed scene, that means that the character has a extra value. This is not a character like in your average action-adventure movie that, you know, the hero comes out with a submachine gun and mows down 500 people in a stadium or something, and they're all just, you know, seen in the distance going, ah, and then falling down dead. When you get somebody who can give a speech, when you get somebody who gets that moment where the hero comes over and cradles their head in their arm and says, please tell me, what are your last words to us on earth? That's special. And Darius gets that. So he is not just another conquest. This is somebody who is special. And you can expect that his last words will then be extra special. So you get this little speech, and we don't have to go into all of it, but he says, the throne is over for me. My luck has run out. So the high heavens revolve. Their turning is towards sorrow, and their profit is pain. Look at me before you say, I am exalted above all this great company of heroes. Know that evil and good both come from God, and see that you remain grateful to him. And a little bit later on that same page, which for us is 199, he offers the simple phrase, greatness too must pass. Now that's interesting. And, it's the sort of broad field scope that you would expect of somebody who's reached the end of his life and finally sees, in a moment of clarity, what's it all about? But there's a specific character here. He's not saying a lot of other things that people on their deathbed might say, Tell my mom I love her. Reach out to my ex-wife and tell her that I didn't mean to cheat with that stewardess. Those sorts of things aren't brought up. What he does bring up is this kind of fatalism, this little philosophy of greatness too must pass. Why would he do this? Why would a great Persian hero say this on his deathbed in this particular poem? Yeah.
I don't know if it's correct, but I'm just seeing it more as he's just saying that you can't escape death no matter how great you are. I think it was something like, it doesn't matter if you're like a prince or a pauper or something like that he mentioned.
Yeah.
You're still gonna die. You're still gonna, fate will carry you to your deathbed.
Yeah. There's a long tradition of that in poetry. There's a long tradition of that in, culture throughout, in all manifestations. We all come to the same end in a certain degree. And it doesn't matter, how great you are. But just think about the context of this. He's not just anybody. He is a great prince of Persia who has just been conquered. That sounds an awful lot like, all the princes who had been conquered when Islam came to town. The culture at large was conquered. And all those previous practitioners of the Persian culture saw their way of life kind of swept away. And this new regime of very powerful forces come in its place and say, this is the way it is now. This is our way, which, by the way, is God's way, and we will be here forever. You say something?
I was going to ask, did the two slaves or the two people, did they kill him so that the other brother could become king, or was it just they didn't like him?
We'll get to the two aides who betrayed him. We'll get there in a second. But right now, just think. Think of this Persian prince who is coming to this conclusion that, my dad was king. I forget if he was king at this point yet or if he was still just a prince. Obviously, somebody with a great claim on importance. And he's giving this speech about, yeah, but it all just, we're all the same in the end. Do you think that's a message that the people on top take comfort in, or the people on the bottom?
It's a little bit of both.
How so? A little bit of both?
People on top, they can be aware that, oh, this can also be me. And then on the bottom, they're like, oh, this could be a chance for me to also go on top. Or all the people on top come down.
Yeah, it's a hint on both ends. Agreeing?
Actually, I was going to say it was more for the people on top, like the different parties, so the conquerors and the people who got conquered,
Yeah.
or people in charge, who were in charge and who used to be in charge. So I think it's just a polite way of saying that, hey, this happens.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but that's a spiritual assault, even if I'm not nice to you. I think they're nudging in that direction.
Yeah. Here, I would say the poem is reminding you of its broader purpose here, which is to poke those people at the top who think that they are so important as an imperial force that they will be there forever. You can't challenge me. It's ordained. I'm powerful on top forever. Those people do not want to hear that you could get struck down too. Fate's a funny thing. In the end, everything can fall apart. In the end, if nothing else, you will die. But cultures and regimes have their own lifespan as well. And here, I think, is what he's getting at here. He's using this one figure, Darius, coughing out his last breath on the battlefield. He's using that one figure to represent the whole culture, who at this point, yeah, they're down. The classical Persian culture is on its own deathbed of sorts. But it's looking up at the powerful ones in charge and saying, this can happen to you too. Don't be so overconfident. And you can ascribe an awful lot of that to just a general, feel-good philosophy. Hey, everything comes around, goes around, what's up is down, and everything's going to work out in the end. Kumbaya, Jimmy Buffett rules. But given this context, they're loading it up with so much other cultural significance that it's much more profound than that. It's not just, don't worry, be happy. It's something more revolutionary than that. It's using the poem, which is gathering together the legendary stories and the very real cultural identity of this Persian demographic, to use a scientific word, and saying this has its own value regardless of who might be in charge at the time. And you just need to stay true to that. Now, I prefer talking in terms of the poem itself. Behind this is, of course, a poet, Ferdowsi, who was, by all accounts, a very devout Muslim and a fairly like minor nobility figure, aristocracy, but not super high up, just enough that he was educated and he had the time to do this. But you can see a lot of individual personality getting thrown out here. Ferdowsi, I believe, was from Eastern Persia, which would have been at a little bit more geographical distance from the power centers of the caliphate to the west. So you can see where he might be a little bit more embedded in certain cultures. Every geography has its own cultural imprint, and something that hits in one area might filter out an awful lot before it starts to get picked up in another area, and by that time it's become something completely different. It's like New York is where all new culture starts, but then as it filters through the rest of the country and the rest of the world, it takes on very different characters as it goes along. Ferdowsi is aware of this, and he is protecting his strain of ancient Persian culture within a very, within a specifically Islamic context. The line, evil and good both come from God, is an example of Zoroastrianism. That duality we spoke of, evil and good. But that focus on God itself has a little bit of an Islamic tinge to it, because God is the one, God is the singular figure in a way that that Zoroastrianism can never really attain because of its duality focus. Dara's speech also expresses that, remain faithful to God. Remain faithful is another way of saying, submission. Submission itself means Islam. Islam means submission. So there is a very real interweaving of ancient Persian culture with the new Islamic culture that has come about. He's not rejecting one or the other, and this is all happening on a kind of a subterranean level, but he is bringing them together in certain ways. It's not necessarily always, providing a mix for them, but he's showing them as distinct elements within his culture. Really fascinating the way he does this in little tiny ways. Again, I'm singling out little words here. I'm singling out little phrases, little nuggets that he's throwing out that are so easy to miss when you're reading along. And I get that, reading is, oh, I got 20 more pages before I can go to bed. Let me just go through this. And you're reading words. But if you just pump the brakes occasionally, you can find like, hey, that's an odd word. Why use that? Or is that really, why have that happen and not this? Those little things poke you into reading this the way it wants to be read. Because remember, when you were writing for the emperor, or whatever he wants to be called, there are consequences to what you write. So if you want to say something at all revolutionary, it's got to be deeply embedded in there. So it's a bit of a mystery, a bit of a puzzle as you go through this. He can't come right out and say the Islamic regime is killing our culture. Not only would his poem never get published, he would likely be killed. It's good to be the king. But by providing these little hints, these little oddities in the text that you're puzzling through as you come across them, like, what? That's weird. That's not something I would expect in an average little historical adventure story or anything like that. Those curiosities start to pile up and suggest where the poet wants you to go with this. You don't have to go there, but if you really want the full experience, the richness of what this poem is actually doing, then you gotta follow along a little bit. You gotta give it some room. Dara's speech also hints at or suggests on his deathbed, do me a favor, my dying wish here, go and marry my daughter. Which, of course, again, never looked too closely at the family connections in ancient literature, would have been Sekandar's niece. But what that is another tie between Alexander of Macedonia and the Persian culture, and the idea that his line is now adding to the greater Persian identity. He is a great hero. They don't want to sacrifice him, so they have to appropriate him in any way they can through his offspring.